When Colonel Orleano Buendia reopened the workshop, finally seduced by the peaceful charms of old age, Orleano II thought it would be a good business to dedicate himself to the manufacture of gold fishes. The trade seemed so laborious to him, and the memory of Petricote so persistent and compelling, that after 3 weeks she disappeared from the workshop. It was around this time that he hit Petricotes for raffling off rabbits. They reproduced and became adults so quickly that they barely had time to sell the raffle numbers. At dawn, Orleano II opened the door and saw the patio paved with rabbits. "These are the ones that were born last night," he said. "How awful," he said. "Why don't you try cows?" A few days later, trying to relieve her yard, Petricotes traded the rabbits for a cow, which 2 months later gave birth to triplets. Overnight, Orleano II became the owner of land and cattle, and he barely had time to expand the overflowing stables and pigsties. Ursula wondered what trouble she had gotten herself into, if she was not stealing. It annoyed him so much that one day when Orleano II woke up in a brimming mood, he appeared with a drawer of money, a can of paste and a brush, and singing the old songs of Francisco the Man at the top of his voice, he papered the house for inside and out, and top to bottom, with peso bills. Orleano II finished wallpapering from the facade to the kitchen, including the bathrooms and bedrooms, and threw the remaining bills in the patio. "Now," he finally said, "I hope no one in this house ever talks to me about money again." That's how it went. Ursula had the bills removed from the large cakes of lime, and she repainted the house white. "My God," she begged. "Make us as poor as we were when we founded this town, lest in the afterlife you are going to charge us for this dilapidation." His pleas were heard in the opposite direction. In fact, one of the workers who was detaching the bills inadvertently tripped over a huge plaster Saint Joseph that someone had left in the house in the last years of the war, and the hollow image shattered on the floor. It was stuffed full of gold coins. 3 men brought it, explained Amaranta. But they never looked for him again. The belated realization of his involuntary paganism aggravated his grief. She spat out the spectacular pile of coins, put it in 3 canvas bags, and buried it in a secret place, hoping that sooner or later the 3 strangers would come to claim it. Macondo was shipwrecked in miraculous prosperity. The mud and reed houses of the founders had been replaced by brick constructions. It was a delirious dream, barely comparable to those of her great-grandfather, because the stony bed and the numerous obstacles in the current impeded transit from Macondo to the sea. But José Arcadio II, in an unexpected outburst of recklessness, insisted on the project. When Colonel Orleano Buendia told him the story of the Spanish galleon that ran aground 12 kilometers from the sea, whose charred ribs he himself saw during the war, it was a revelation for José Arcadio II. He auctioned off his roosters to the highest bidder, recruited men, and bought tools, and engaged in the colossal undertaking of breaking stones, digging canals, clearing reefs, and even leveling waterfalls. José Arcadio II gave his brother a detailed statement of his plans, and he gave her the money she needed for his company. He disappeared for a long time. When news spread that a strange ship was approaching the village, they rushed to the shore and watched with stunned eyes of disbelief the arrival of the first and last ship ever to dock in the village. It was nothing more than a raft of logs, dragged on thick cables by 20 men walking along the riverbank. Along with him came a group of splendid matrons who protected themselves from the scorching sun with colorful umbrellas, and had precious silk shawls on their shoulders, and colored ointments on their faces. The log raft was the only vehicle that José Arcadio II was able to take up to Macondo, and only once, but he never recognized the failure of his enterprise but rather proclaimed his feat as a victory of the will. He gave scrupulous accounts to his brother, and very soon he sank back into the routine of the roosters. The only thing that remained of that ill-fated initiative was the breath of renewal brought by the matrons of France, whose magnificent arts changed the traditional methods of love, and whose sense of social welfare raised Catarino's antiquated store and transformed the street into a bazaar of Japanese lanterns and nostalgic street organs. They were the promoters of the bloody carnival that plunged Macondo into delirium for 3 days, and whose only lasting consequence was having given Orleano II the opportunity to meet Fernanda del Carpio. Remedios the Beauty was proclaimed queen. Ursula, who shuddered at the disturbing beauty of her great-granddaughter, could not prevent her choice. Until then she had managed to keep her from going out on the street, except to go to mass with Amaranta, but she forced her to cover her face with a black mantilla. It was a long time before they succeeded, and it would have been better for them if the occasion had never come, because most of them could never recover the placidity of sleep. He was so handsome, so graceful and calm, of such well-cared poise, that Pietro Crespi would have looked like a 7-month-old next to him, and many women murmured with spiteful smiles that he was the one who truly deserved the mantilla. On the 6th Sunday, the gentleman appeared with a yellow rose in his hand. He heard the mass standing up, as he always did, and at the end he stood in the way of Remedios, the beauty, and offered her the solitary rose. She received it with a natural gesture, and then she uncovered her face for a moment and thanked her with a smile. Orleano II was the only one who felt cordial compassion for him, and he tried to break his perseverance. "Don't waste any more time," he told her one night. "The women of this house are worse than the mules." But he failed to break his obstinacy. Nothing made him give up, except his own and his lamentable state of demoralization. From handsome and impeccable he became vile and ragged. He became a man of lawsuits, a rowdy bartender, and woke up wallowing in his own excrescences in Caterino's store. The saddest thing about his drama was that Remedios the beauty didn't notice him even when he showed up at church dressed as a prince. He received the yellow rose without the slightest malice, rather amused by the extravagance of her gesture, and he lifted his mantilla to better see her face and not to show her his. In reality, Remedios the beauty was not a being of this world. Until puberty was well advanced, Santa Sofia de la Piedad had to bathe her and put her clothes on, and even when she was able to fend for herself, she had to be watched so that she did not paint little animals on the walls with a wand smeared with her own poop. She reached the age of 20 without learning to read and write, without using cutlery at the table, walking around the house naked, because her nature resisted any kind of convention. When the young commander of the guard declared his love for her, she refused him simply because she was amazed at her frivolity. "Look how simple it is," she told Amarantak. "She says that she is dying for me, as if I were colic Misraer." When indeed he was found dead by her window, Remedios the beauty confirmed her initial impression. "You see her," he commented. It was completely simple. It seemed as if a penetrating lucidity allowed him to see the reality of things beyond any formalism. She was not in any way mentally retarded, as was believed, quite the contrary. Ursula decided to separate her from her world, to preserve her from all earthly temptation, not knowing that Remedios the beauty, already from her mother's womb, was safe from any contagion. It never crossed her mind that she would be elected beauty queen in the pandemonium of a carnival. But Orleano II, excited with the whirlwind of disguising himself as a tiger. Ursula consented to the coronation. The news that Remedios Buendia was going to be the sovereign of the festival went beyond the limits of the swamp in a few hours. If anyone was harmless at that time, it was the aged and disenchanted Colonel Orleano Buendia, who little by little had been losing all contact with the reality of the nation. Shut up in his workshop, his only relationship with the rest of the world was the trade in goldfish. It took so much concentration to socket scales, set tiny rubies in eyes, laminate gills, and assemble rudders that there was not a single void left for him to fill with the disillusionment of war. So absorbing was the attention that the preciousness of his craftsmanship demanded of him, that in a short time he grew older than in all the years of war, and the position twisted his spine and the millimeter worn his eyesight, but the relentless concentration rewarded him with peace of mind. Colonel Orleano Buendia barely understood that the secret of a good old age is nothing other than an honest pact with solitude. Someone ever dared to disturb his loneliness? "How are you, Colonel?" he told her as he passed by. "Here," he replied. "Waiting for my funeral to happen." So the concern caused by the public reappearance of his last name, regarding the reign of Remedios, La Bella, had no real basis. Many, however, did not think so. Innocent of the tragedy that threatened it, the town overflowed into the public square, in a boisterous explosion of joy. Orleano II had finally fulfilled his dream of disguising himself as a tiger and was walking happily among the wild crowd. For a moment, the peaceful inhabitants of Macondo took off their masks to better see the dazzling creature with a crown of emeralds and an ermine cape. But Orleano II seated Remedios the beauty and the intrusive queen in a Solomonic manner on the same pedestal. Suddenly, in the paroxysm of the party, someone broke the delicate balance. "Long live the Liberal Party!" The scream dash. "Long live Colonel Orleano Buendia!" Rifle volleys drowned out the splendor of the fireworks, and the screams of terror drowned out the music, the jubilation drowned out by panic. The version prevailed forever that the Royal Guard, without provocation of any kind, took up combat positions at a signal from their commander and fired mercilessly at the crowd. When calm was restored, not a single false Bedouin remained in the town, and 9 clowns, 4 Colombian women, 17 kings of cards, a devil, 3 musicians, 2 pairs of France and 3 Japanese empresses. In the confusion of panic, José Arcadio II managed to get Remedios the beauty to safety, and Orleano II carried the intruding sovereign to the house in his arms, her dress torn and her ermine cape smeared with blood. She was called Fernanda del Carpio. Ursula took care of her as if she were her daughter. 6 months after the massacre, when the wounded recovered and the last flowers in the mass grave withered, Orleano II went to look for her in the distant city where he lived with his father, and married her in Macondo, in a noisy party of 20 days. The marriage was about to end after 2 months because Orleano II, trying to make amends to Petricotes, had her take a portrait dressed as the Queen of Madagascar. When Fernanda found out, she packed up her newlywed trunks again and left Macondo without saying goodbye to her. Orleano II caught up with her on the road to the swamp. After many entreaties and amends he succeeded in taking her back to her house, and he abandoned her concubine. Petricotes, aware of her strength, showed no concern. She had made him a man. While he was still a child, she took him out of Melchiad's room, with his head full of fantastic ideas and without any contact with reality, and gave him a place in the world. Nature had made him reserved and aloof, with tendencies toward solitary meditation, and she had molded the opposite character, vital, expansive, unbuttoned, and had instilled in him the joy of living and the pleasure of partying and waste, until make him, inside and out, the man she had dreamed of for her since adolescence. He did not dare anticipate the news. He assumed such a childish attitude towards the situation that he feigned false grudges and imaginary resentments, looking for a way for Petricotes to be the one to cause the breakup. One day when Orleano Segundo reproached her unfairly, she avoided the trap and put things in her place. "What happens," she said, "is that you want to marry the queen." Orleano Segundo, ashamed of her, feigned a collapse of rage, declared that he was misunderstood and outraged by her, and did not visit her again. To those who pitied his fate, he reassured them with a smile. "Don't worry," he told them. "The queens do my errands for me." Just as she had foreseen, Orleano Segundo returned to her house as soon as the honeymoon was over. He brought his usual buddies. In the heat of the party he lit up that afternoon, he had Petricotes dressed as a queen, crowned her absolute sovereign for life of Madagascar, and distributed copies of her portrait among her friends. He had only been married 2 months, but she quickly realized that things were not going well in the marriage bed, and she experienced the delicious pleasure of revenge accomplished. 2 days later, however, when he did not dare to return, but instead sent an intermediary to arrange the terms of their separation, she realized that she was going to need more patience than expected, because he seemed willing to sacrifice himself for appearances. She didn't change then either. She didn't have to wait as long as she supposed she did. In reality, Orleano Segundo understood from the wedding night that he would return to Petricotes' house. Fernanda was a woman lost to the world. Until puberty, Fernanda had no other news of the world than the melancholy piano exercises performed in a neighboring house by someone who for years and years allowed himself the will not to take a siesta. In her sick mother's room, green and yellow under the dusty light of the stained glass windows, "We are immensely rich and powerful," he told her. "One day you will be queen." She believed him, although they only occupied the long table with linen tablecloths and silver services, to have a cup of chocolate with water and a sweet bread. Until the day of the wedding she dreamed of a reign of legend, despite the fact that her father, Don Fernando, had to mortgage her house to buy her trousseau. It was not naivete or delusions of grandeur. That's how they educated her. "She is different," explained the nuns. "She is going to be queen." Her companions believed it, because even then she was the most beautiful, distinguished, and discreet maiden they had ever seen. After 8 years, she returned to her parents' house to weave funeral palms. He found it looted. Barely the essential furniture remained, the chandeliers and the silverware, because the household items had been sold, one by one, to defray the expenses of her education. Her mother had succumbed to the 5 o'clock fever. Her father, Don Fernando, dressed in black, with a laminated collar and a gold watch chain across his chest, gave her a silver coin on Mondays for household expenses, and took away the funeral wreaths he had finished the week before. He never carried close friendship with anyone. She never heard of the wars that bled the country dry. She was even beginning to lose the illusion of being queen, when 2 peremptory knocks sounded at the gate, and she opened it for a handsome military man. She locked herself in with her father in the office. 2 hours later, her father went to look for her in the sewing room. "Get her things ready," he told her. "She has a long journey to make." That was how they took her to Macondo. In a single day, with a brutal blow, her life threw on top of her the full weight of a reality that her parents had hidden from her for years. On her way home she locked herself in her room to cry, indifferent to Don Fernando's pleas and explanations, trying to erase the burn of that unheard of mockery. She had promised herself not to leave her bedroom until her death, when Orleano Segundo came looking for her. He searched for her mercilessly. With the atrocious temerity with which José Arcadio Buendía crossed the mountains to found Macondo, with the blind pride with which Colonel Orleano Buendía promoted his useless wars, with the insane tenacity with which Ursula ensured the survival of the lineage, thus Orleano Segundo sought to Fernanda, without a single moment of discouragement. Don Fernando declined the invitation to accompany them. He promised to come later, when he finished paying off his commitments, and from the moment he gave his daughter his blessing, he locked himself in his office again, writing her the obituaries with mournful vignettes and the family coat of arms that were to be written. Be the first human contact that Fernanda and her father had in their entire lives? For her, that was the actual date of her birth. For Orleano Segundo it was almost at the same time the beginning and the end of happiness. Orleano Segundo saw the most beautiful woman on earth, with the glorious eyes of a frightened animal and her long copper-colored hair spread out on her pillow. Fernanda had put on a white nightgown, long to the ankles and with sleeves up to the cuffs, and with a large, round buttonhole neatly trimmed at the level of her belly. Orleano Segundo could not repress an explosion of laughter. "This is the most obscene thing I've ever seen in my life," he shouted, with a laugh that echoed throughout the house. "I married a little sister of charity." A month later, having failed to get her wife to remove her nightgown, he went off to do the portrait of Petra Coates dressed as a queen. Later, when he managed to get Fernanda to return home, she gave in to her urges in the fever of reconciliation, but she did not know how to give him the rest he dreamed of. Orleano Segundo only found in her a deep feeling of desolation. One night, shortly before her first child was born, Fernanda realized that her husband had secretly returned to Petra Coates' bed. "That's right," he admitted. And he explained in a tone of prostrate resignation, "I had to do it, so that the animals would continue giving birth." It took him a little time to convince her of such a strange expedient, but when he finally succeeded, through evidence that seemed irrefutable, the only promise that Fernanda imposed on him was that he would not let himself be surprised by the death in his concubine's bed. That's how the three of them continued to live, without getting in each other's way, Orleano Segundo punctual and affectionate with both of them, Petra Coates strutting about their reconciliation, and Fernanda pretending that she didn't know the truth. The pact did not, however, get Fernanda to join her family. Ursula insisted in vain. Despite the visible hostility of her family, Fernanda did not give up her will to impose the habits of her elder. She ended the custom of eating in the kitchen, and when everyone was hungry, and imposed the obligation to do so at exact times at the large dining room table, she imposed herself, as well as praying the rosary before dinner. While Ursula enjoyed the full control of her faculties, some of the old habits survived and the life of the family preserved a certain influence of her hunches, but when she lost her sight and the weight of the years relegated her to a corner, the circle of the rigidity initiated by Fernanda from the moment she arrived ended up closing completely, and no one but her determined the fate of the family. Fernanda considered the confectionery and candy animals business, which Santa Sofia de la Piedad maintained by Ursula's will, an undignified activity, and she wasted no time in liquidating it. The doors of the house were finally closed forever. The branch of aloe and the bread that were hanging on the lintel since the time of the foundation were replaced by a niche of the heart of Jesus. Colonel Orleano Buendia managed to realize those changes and foresaw their consequences. "We are becoming fine people," he protested. "At this rate, we will end up fighting the conservative regime again, but now to put a king in its place." Fernanda, with very good tact, took care not to bump into him. But she had to allow this loose piece of the family mechanism, because she was certain that the old colonel was an animal appeased by years and disappointment, who in a fit of senile rebellion could uproot the foundations of the house. When her husband decided to name their first child after her great-grandfather, she did not dare to oppose it, because she had only been here a year. But when her first daughter was born she unreservedly expressed her determination that she be named Renata, after her mother. Ursula had decided that she should be called Remedios. They baptized her with the name of Renata Remedios, but Fernanda continued to call her Renata, while her husband's family and her entire town continued to call her Meme, short for Remedios. At first, Fernanda did not talk about her family, but over time, she began to idealize her father. She spoke of him at table as an exceptional being who had renounced all forms of vanity and was becoming a saint. Despite that smiling conspiracy, the children got used to thinking of their grandfather as a legendary being, who transcribed pious verses for them in letters and sent them every Christmas a box of gifts that barely fit through the front door. They were, in fact, the last remains of the stately heritage. Little by little, the funerary splendor of the old and frozen mansion was transferred to the luminous house of the Buendias. "They have already sent us the entire family cemetery," commented Orleano Segundo on one occasion. "Only the willows and the tombstones are missing." Although nothing ever arrived in the drawers that the children could play with. On the 10th Christmas, when little Jose Arcadio was already preparing to travel to the seminary, grandfather's huge box arrived earlier than in previous years. They found inside a long lead chest closed with copper bolts. When he raised the lead platform and saw Don Fernando dressed in black and with a crucifix on his chest, his skin bursting into pestilent belches and simmering in a frothy, bubbling broth of live pearls. Shortly after the birth of the girl, the unexpected jubilee of Colonel Orleano Buendia was announced, ordered by the government to celebrate a new anniversary of the Treaty of Neerlandia. The colonel spoke violently against her and refused her homage. He ordered them to leave him alone, insisting that he was not a hero of the nation as they said, but an artisan without memories, whose only dream was to die of exhaustion in oblivion and the misery of his goldfish. What infuriated him the most was the news that the President of the Republic himself planned to attend the acts in Macondo to impose the Order of Merit on him. But the President of the Republic cancelled the trip at the last minute and sent him the decoration with a personal representative. Colonel Gerinaldo Márquez, besieged by pressures of all kinds, left his paralyzed bed to persuade his former comrade in arms. When he saw the rocking chair loaded by 4 men appear and saw sitting in it, Between large pillows, the friend who had shared his victories and misfortunes since his youth, he did not doubt for a single moment that he was making that effort to express his solidarity. But when he learned the true purpose of his visit, he had him removed from the workshop. Too late, I am convinced, he told her, that I would have done you a great favor if I had let you be shot. So the jubilee was held without any of the family members in attendance. From the solitary workshop he heard the martial music, the apparatus artillery, the bells of the Te Deum, and some phrases of the speeches delivered in front of the house when they baptized the street with his name. His eyes moistened with indignation, with furious impotence, and for the first time since the defeat he was hurt that he did not have the nerves of youth to promote a bloody war that would erase every last vestige of the conservative regime. The echoes of the homage had not died out when Ursula knocked on the door of the workshop. "Don't bother me," he said. "I'm busy." "Open up," Ursula insisted in an everyday voice. "This has nothing to do with the party." Then Colonel Orleano Buendia removed the bar, and saw at the door 17 men of the most varied appearances, of all types and colors, but all with a solitary air that would have been enough to identify them anywhere on earth. They were his children. Without agreeing, without knowing each other, they had come from the farthest corners of the coast captivated by the noise of the jubilee. They all proudly bore the name of Orleano, and the surname of his mother. During the 3 days they remained in the house, to Ursula's satisfaction and Fernanda's scandal, they caused war disturbances. Colonel Orleano Buendia, who at first received them with distrust and even questioned the affiliation of some, was amused by their madness, and before they left he gave each of them a little goldfish. Even the elusive José Arcadio Segundo offered them an afternoon of roosters. He decided that they would all stay and work with him. The only one he accepted was Orleano Triste, a big mulatto with the impetus and exploring spirit of his grandfather. The others, though still single, considered his fate settled. They were all skilled craftsmen, men of their house, people of peace. They left in droves, preceded by the band of musicians and bursting rockets, and left the impression in the town that the Buendia lineage had seeds for many centuries. Orleano Triste, with his cross of ashes on his forehead, installed the ice factory that José Arcadio Buendia dreamed of in his inventor's delusions on the outskirts of town. Months after his arrival, Orleano Triste was looking for a house to take his mother and a single sister, and he was interested in the decrepit mansion that seemed abandoned in a corner of the square. He asked who owned it. Someone told him that it was a nobody's house, where once lived a lonely widow who lived on earth and lime from the walls. That if the house was still standing it was because they had not had a severe winter or a devastating wind in recent years. She shouldered against the front door, and the rotting wooden frame collapsed without a crash. And then he saw in the center of the room the scrawny woman still dressed in the clothes of the previous century, with a few yellow threads on her bald skull, and with large, still beautiful eyes, in which the last stars of light had gone out. Hope, and the skin of the face cracked by the aridity of loneliness. Shaken by the vision of another world, Orleano Triste barely noticed that the woman was pointing an old-fashioned military pistol at him. "Excuse me," she murmured. She stood motionless in the center of the room. "For God's sake," she exclaimed in a low voice, "it's not fair that they come to me now with this memory." "I want to rent the house," said Orleano Triste. The woman then raised the pistol, aiming steadily at the cross of ashes, and pulled the trigger with unassailable determination. "Go away," she ordered. That night, during dinner, Orleano Triste told the family about the episode, and Ursula wept with consternation. "My God," she exclaimed, clutching her head in her hands. "She's still alive." The only one who had not lost for a single moment the awareness that she was alive, rotting in her larvae soup, was the implacable and aged Amaranta. Amaranta thought of Rebecca, because loneliness had selected her memories for her, and she had incinerated the numbing heaps of nostalgic garbage that life had accumulated in her heart, and she had purified, magnified, and eternalized the others, the most bitter. Ursula, on the other hand, who had undergone a process contrary to Amaranta's, evoked Rebecca with a memory free of impurities. Orleano Segundo resolved that they had to take her home and protect her, but his good purpose was frustrated by the unwavering intransigence of Rebecca, who had needed many years of suffering and misery to conquer the privileges of solitude, and was not willing to give up them in exchange for an old age disturbed by the false charms of mercy. In February, when the 16 children of Colonel Orleano Buendia returned, still marked with the cross of ashes, Orleano Triste spoke to them about Rebecca in the heat of the party, and in noon they restored the appearance of the house, changed doors and windows, they painted the facade in bright colors, shored up the walls and poured new cement on the floor, but did not obtain authorization to continue the renovations inside. Rebecca didn't even look at the door, and she understood that it would be impossible to rescue her from her stubborn confinement while she had a breath of life left. On the second visit to Macondo by Colonel Orleano Buendia's sons, another of them, Orleano Centeno, stayed working with Orleano Triste. In a short time he increased ice production to such an extent that it surpassed the local market, and Orleano Triste had to think about the possibility of extending the business to other towns in the swamp. It was then that he conceived the decisive step not only for the modernization of his industry, but also to link the population with the rest of the world. "We have to bring the railway," he said. Looking at the drawing that Orleano Triste drew on the table, and which was a direct descendant of the diagrams with which José Arcadio Buendía illustrated the Solar War project, Ursula confirmed her impression that time was going around in circles. Orleano Triste conceived the most insane projects as immediate possibilities. He elaborated rational calculations on costs and deadlines. Orleano II plunked down the money to run the railroad with the same frivolity with which he plunked it down for his brother's absurd shipping company. Orleano Triste consulted the calendar and left the following Wednesday to be back when the rains passed. Orleano Centeno, overwhelmed by the abundance of the factory, had already begun to experiment with making ice based on fruit juices instead of water, and without knowing it or intending it, he conceived the essential foundations of the invention of ice cream. Early last winter, however, a woman washing clothes in the river during the hottest hour shrieked across the central street in an alarming state of shock. "Here she comes," she managed to explain, "a frightening business like a kitchen dragging down a town." At that moment the population was shaken by a whistle with terrifying resonances and a colossal gasping breath. The preceding weeks had seen crews laying sleepers and rails. They saw Orleano Triste waving from the locomotive, and they saw spellbound the flower-adorned train that for the first time arrived 8 months late. They were outraged by the vivid images that the prosperous merchant, Don Bruno Crespi, projected in the theater with lion's mouth box offices, because a dead and buried character in a film, and for whose misfortune tears of affliction were shed, reappeared alive and turned into an Arab. In the next movie, the public, who paid 2 cents to share the vicissitudes of the characters, could not bear that unheard of mockery and broke the stalls. The mayor, at the request of Don Bruno Crespi, explained that the cinema was a machine of illusion. Many considered that they had been victims of a new and showy affair of gypsies, so they chose not to return to the cinema, considering that they already had enough with their own sorrows to cry over the feigned misadventures of imaginary beings. Something similar happened with the cylinder gramophones which the merry matrons of France brought in to replace the old-fashioned street organs, and which so profoundly affected for a time the interests of the band of musicians. It was such a disappointment that when gramophones became popular to the point where there was one in every house, they were still not thought of as objects for adult entertainment, but as a good thing for children to disembowel. On the other hand, when someone from the town had the opportunity to verify the crude reality of the telephone installed in the railway station, which because of the crank was considered a rudimentary version of the gramophone, even the most incredulous were disconcerted. It was an intricate jumble of truths and mirages that convulsed with impatience the ghost of José Arcadio Buendía under the chestnut tree and forced him to walk through the entire house even in broad daylight. Since the railway was officially inaugurated and began to arrive regularly on Wednesdays at 11 o'clock, and the primitive wooden station was built with a desk, telephone, and a window to sell tickets, men and women have been seen on the streets of Macondo. Women who pretended to be ordinary attitudes, but who actually looked like circus people. One of many Wednesdays, the plump and smiling Mr. Herbert arrived in Macondo and had lunch at the house. Orleano II had found it by chance, and as he often did with many foreigners, he took it home. In the following days he was seen with a mesh and a basket hunting butterflies in the outskirts of the town. The inhabitants of Macondo were barely beginning to wonder what the hell was going on, when the town had already been transformed into a camp of wooden houses with zinc roofs, populated by foreigners who came from halfway around the world on the train, not just from the seats and platforms but even on the roof of the cars. The gringos, who later brought their languid women in muslin dresses and large gauze hats, made a separate town on the other side of the train line. No one yet knew what they were after, or if they were really just philanthropists, and they had already caused a colossal upheaval, much more disturbing than that of the ancient gypsies, but less transitory and understandable. Endowed with resources that in other times were reserved for divine providence, they modified the rainfall regime, hastened the harvest cycle, and removed the river from where it had always been and placed it with its white stones and its icy currents at the other end of the population, behind the cemetery. It was on that occasion that they built a concrete fortress over the discolored tomb of José Arcadio, so that the smell of gunpowder from the corpse would not contaminate the waters. For the strangers who arrived without love, they turned the street of the affectionate matrons of France into a town larger than the other, and one Wednesday of glory they brought a train loaded with unlikely whores, Babylonian females trained in immemorial resources, and provided with all class of ointments and devices to stimulate the defenseless, wake up the timid. It was such a tumultuous and untimely invasion that in the early days it was impossible to walk down the street encumbered by furniture and trunks, and the hustle and bustle of carpenters who would stop their houses on any bare ground without anyone's permission. The only corner of serenity was established by the peaceful West Indian blacks who built a marginal street, with wooden houses on stilts. So many changes occurred in such a short time that 8 months after Mr. Herbert's visit, the old inhabitants of Macondo got up early to see their own town. "Look at the shit we've been looking for," Colonel Orleano Buendía used to say then, just for inviting a gringo to eat a banana. Orleano II, on the other hand, was not happy with the avalanche of foreigners. The house was suddenly filled with unknown guests. Fernanda had to choke on her scruples and attend like royalty to guests of the most perverse condition. Amaranta was so scandalized by the invasion of the common people that she went back to eating in the kitchen as in the old days. Colonel Orleano Buendia chose to lock himself up and was never seen again except on very few occasions sitting in the street door. Ursula, on the other hand, even in the days when she already dragged her feet and walked groping the walls, she experienced a childish joy when the arrival of the train approached. "You have to make meat and fish," she ordered the 4 cooks. "You have to do everything," she insisted, "because you never know what outsiders want to eat." More than a year had passed since Mr. Herbert's visit, and the only thing that was known was that the gringos planned to plant bananas in the enchanted region that José Arcadio Buendia and his men had crossed looking for the root of the great inventions. 2 other sons of Colonel Orleano Buendia, with their cross of ashes on their foreheads, arrived dragged by that volcanic belch. "We come," they said, "because everyone comes." Remedios the Beauty was the only one who remained immune to the banana plague. She stagnated in a magnificent adolescence, increasingly impervious to formalism, more indifferent to malice and suspicion, happy in her own world of simple realities. She did not understand why women complicated their lives with bodices and petticoats, so she sewed herself a canvas loop that simply slipped over her head and solved the problem of dressing without further ado, without taking away the impression of being naked, which as she understood things it was the only decent way to be home. They bothered her so much to cut off the rain hair that she already had down to her calves, and to make buns with combs and braids with red ribbons, that she simply shaved her head and made wigs for the saints. The amazing thing about her simplifying instinct was that the more disturbing was her incredible beauty and the more provocative her behavior with men. When Colonel Orleano Buendia's children were in Macondo for the first time, Ursula remembered that they carried the same blood in their veins as their great-granddaughter, and she shuddered with a forgotten fear. "Open your eyes wide," she warned her. "With any of them, the children will come out with a pig's tail." However, Remedios the Beauty would have died laughing if she had known that precaution. Until the last moment she was on earth she ignored that her irreparable fate as a disturbing female was a daily disaster. What no member of the family ever knew was that it didn't take long for the outsiders to realize that Remedios the Beauty was giving off a breath of disturbance, a gust of torment, that was still perceptible several hours after she had passed. Expert men in love disorders, tried throughout the world, affirmed that they had never suffered an anxiety similar to that produced by the natural smell of Remedios, the Beauty. That is why they were the only ones who understood that the young commander of the guard had died of love, and that a knight from another land had thrown himself into despair. Unaware of the disturbing environment in which she moved, of the unbearable state of intimate calamity that she provoked as she passed, Remedios the Beauty treated men without the slightest malice and had just upset them with her innocent complacency. When Ursula managed to impose the order that she eat with Amaranta in the kitchen so that outsiders would not see her, she felt more comfortable because, after all, she was safe from any discipline. Actually, she did not care to eat anywhere, and not at fixed hours but according to the alternatives of her appetite. When things were better, she would get up at 11 in the morning, and she would lock herself up completely naked in the bathroom for up to 2 hours, killing scorpions while she woke up from the dense and prolonged sleep. One day, when she was beginning to bathe, a stranger lifted a tile from the ceiling and gasped at the tremendous sight of her nakedness. "Careful," he exclaimed. "He is going to fall." "I just want to see her," murmured the stranger. "Oh well," she said. "But be careful, those tiles are rotten." Remedios, the Beauty, thought that she was suffering from the fear that the tiles would break, and she bathed more quickly than usual so that the man would not remain in danger. The stranger mistook this chatter for a way to hide her pleasure, so when she began to soap herself she gave in to the temptation to take a step forward. "Let me soap her up," he murmured. "I appreciate the good intention," she said, "but 2 hands are enough for me." "Even if it's the back," the stranger pleaded. "It would be idle," she said. "People have never been seen soaping her back." Afterward, as she dried herself, the stranger begged her with tearful eyes to marry him. She answered him sincerely that she would never marry a man so simple that she wasted almost an hour, and she even went without lunch, just to see a woman bathe. In the end, she removed 2 more tiles to lower herself into the bathroom. "It's very high," she warned him, frightened. "She is going to kill herself." The rotten tiles shattered in a crash of disaster, and the man barely managed to utter a cry of terror, and he cracked his skull and died without agony on the cement floor. The strangers who heard the noise in the dining room, and hastened to take the corpse away, perceived the suffocating smell of Remedios the Beauty on her skin. It was so attuned to the body that the cracks in the skull did not flow blood but an amber oil impregnated with that secret perfume, and then they understood that the smell of Remedios, the Beauty, continued to torture men beyond death, until the end. Dust from his bones. However, they did not connect that horrific accident with the other 2 men who had died for Remedios the Beauty. A victim was still missing before the outsiders, and many of the old inhabitants of Macondo, would give credence to the legend that Remedios Buendia did not exhale a breath of love, but a mortal flow. The opportunity to check it out came months later, one afternoon when Remedios the Beauty went with a group of friends to see the new plantations. Since the group of friends entered the plantation, the air was impregnated with a deadly fragrance. The men who worked in the trenches were possessed by a strange fascination, threatened by an unseen danger, and many succumbed to the terrible desire to cry. Remedios, the Beauty, and her frightened friends managed to take refuge in a nearby house when they were about to be assaulted by a mob of ferocious males. Shortly after they were rescued by the 4 Aurelians. Remedios, the Beauty, did not tell anyone that one of the men, taking advantage of the tumult, managed to attack her belly with a hand that looked more like an eagle's claw clinging to the edge of a precipice. She faced the assailant in a kind of instant daze, seeing the disconsolate eyes that burned into her heart like an ember of pity. That night, the man bragged about his audacity and bragged about his luck in the street of the Turks, minutes before a horse's kick shattered his chest, and a crowd of strangers saw him dying in the middle of the street, drowning in vomit of blood. The assumption that Remedios the Beauty possessed the powers of death was then supported by 4 irrefutable facts. A feeling as primitive and simple as love would have sufficed, but that was the one thing that no one thought of. Ursula did not bother with her again. In another time, when she had not yet given up the purpose of saving her for the world, but deep down she was deceiving herself trying to train her for domestic happiness, because she was convinced that once passion was satisfied, there was no man above her. Land capable of withstanding even for one day neglect that was beyond all comprehension. The birth of the last José Arcadio, and her unwavering will to educate him to be pope, ended up making her give up her worries about her great-granddaughter. He abandoned her to her fate, trusting that sooner or later a miracle would happen, and that in this world where there was everything there would also be a man with enough cashiza to carry her. Long before, Amaranta had given up any attempt to turn her into a useful woman. Fernanda didn't even try to understand her. When she saw Remedios, the Beauty, dressed as a queen in the bloody carnival, she thought that she was an extraordinary creature. But when she saw her eating with her hands, unable to give an answer that was not a prodigy of simplicity, the only thing she regretted was that the fools of the family had such a long life. Despite the fact that Colonel Orleano Buendia continued to believe and repeat that Remedios the Beauty was really the most lucid being he had ever met, and that she demonstrated it at every moment with her amazing ability to make fun of everyone, they abandoned her to the good of God. Remedios, the Beauty, remained wandering through the desert of solitude, without crosses on her back, maturing in her dreams without nightmares, in her endless baths, in her meals without schedules, in her deep and prolonged silences without memories. Until one afternoon in March when Fernanda wanted to fold her twine sheets in her garden, and she asked the women of the house for help. They had hardly begun when Amaranta noticed that Remedios, the Beauty, was translucent with an intense paleness. "You feel bad?" She asked him. Remedios the Beauty, who was holding the sheet at the other end, smiled pityingly. "On the contrary," he said, "I've never felt better." She finished saying it, when Fernanda felt that a delicate wind of light tore the sheets from her hands and unfolded them in all her width. Amaranta felt a mysterious tremor in the lace of her petticoat and tried to hold onto the sheet so as not to fall, just as Remedios the Beauty began to rise. Left the sheets at the mercy of the light, seeing Remedios, the Beauty, who waved goodbye to her, amid the dazzling flutter of the sheets that rose with her, and they were lost with her forever in the high air where they could not even the highest birds of memory can reach it. Fernanda, bitten by her envy, ended up accepting her prodigy, and for a long time she kept begging God to give her back the sheets. Perhaps she would not have talked about anything else for a long time, if the barbaric extermination of the Aurelians had not replaced her astonishment with her fright. She did not understand what they were going to do in a town that overnight had become a place of danger. The local authorities, after the armistice of Neerlandia, were mayors without initiative, decorative judges, chosen from among the peaceful and tired conservatives of Macondo. "This is a regime of poor devils, we made so many wars, and everything so that they would not paint our house blue." When the Banana Company arrived, however, local officials were replaced by authoritarian outsiders. Former police officers were replaced by machete-wielding hitmen. Shut up in the workshop, Colonel Orleano Buendia thought about these changes, and for the first time in his silent years of solitude he was tormented by the definite certainty that it had been a mistake not to continue the war to its ultimate consequences. In those days, a brother of the forgotten Colonel Magnifico Vispal took his 7-year-old grandson to have a drink in the carts in the square, and because the boy accidentally bumped into a police corporal and spilled the drink on his uniform, the barbarian chopped him into pieces with a machete and beheaded the grandfather who tried to stop him. For Colonel Orleano Buendia it was the limit of expiation. "One of these days," he shouted, "I'm going to arm my boys so they can finish off these fucking gringos." In the course of that week, in different parts of the coast, his 17 children were hunted like rabbits by invisible criminals who aimed at the center of their crosses of ashes. Orleano Triste was leaving his mother's house at 7 at night, when a rifle shot emerged from the darkness and pierced his forehead. Orleano Centeno was found in the hammock that he used to hang in the factory, with an ice pick stuck up to the hilt between his eyebrows. Orleano Serrator, someone fired a revolver shot that knocked him down into a cauldron of boiling lard. Orleano Archia opened the door and was greeted with a Mauser blast that shattered his skull. That night of death, while the house was preparing to watch over the 4 corpses, the telegrams received from different places along the coast made it possible to understand that the viciousness of the invisible enemy was directed only against the brothers marked with crosses of ashes. Until only the eldest remained. They remembered him very well because of the contrast of his dark skin with the big green eyes. His name was Orleano Amador, he was a carpenter, and he lived in a remote town in the foothills of the mountains. Orleano Amador was safe. The night of the extermination, 2 men had gone looking for him at his house, and they had discharged their revolvers against him, but they had not hit the cross of ashes. But they had never heard from him again. Those were dark days for Colonel Orleano Buendia. The President of the Republic sent him a telegram of condolences, in which he promised an exhaustive investigation, and paid tribute to the dead. By his order, the mayor showed up at the funeral with 4 funeral wreaths that he intended to place on the coffins, but the colonel put him out on the street. As he had during the war with the death of his best friends, he felt not a sense of regret, but a blind and directionless rage, a debilitating helplessness. Colonel Orleano Buendia was unable to regain his composure for a long time. He abandoned the manufacture of little fish, ate with difficulty, and walked like a sleepwalker throughout the house. After 3 months his hair was ashen, the old mustache with gummed ends dripping over his colorless lips, but instead his eyes were once again the 2 embers that frightened those who saw him born and that once made chairs roll. Just by looking at them. One morning he found Ursula crying under her chestnut tree, on the knees of her dead husband. Colonel Orleano Buendia was the only inhabitant of the house who did not continue to see the powerful old man overwhelmed by half a century of weather. "Say hello to your father," Ursula told him. He stopped for a moment in front of the chestnut tree, and once again found that that empty space did not arouse any affection in him either. "What does it say?" he asked. "He's very sad," answered Ursula, "because he thinks you're going to die." "Tell him," the colonel smiled, "that one doesn't die when he should, but when he can." The omen of his dead father removed the last ember of arrogance that remained in his heart, but he mistook it for a sudden breath of strength. That was why he besieged Ursula so that she would reveal to him where in the patio the gold coins that they found inside the plaster San Jose were buried. "You'll never know," she told him. The old supporters to whom she turned for help hid so as not to receive it. It was around this time that she was heard to say, "The only difference today between liberals and conservatives is that liberals go to mass at 5 and conservatives go to mass at 8. However, she insisted so hard, she begged in such a way that she managed to collect more money in 8 months than Ursula had buried. She then visited the ailing Colonel Gabriel Márquez to help him promote total war. He kept in contact with the rebel officers who were faithful to him until the defeat. He waged with them the sad war of daily humiliation, of pleas and memorials, of coming back tomorrow, of almost there, of we are studying his case with due attention, the irremediably lost war against the very attentive and confident servants who had to assign and never assigned life pensions. The other war, the bloody 20-year war, did not wreak as much havoc on them as the corrosive war of eternal postponement. Colonel Gabriel Márquez himself, who escaped 3 attacks, survived 5 wounds and emerged unscathed from countless battles, succumbed to the atrocious siege of waiting and sank into the miserable defeat of old age thinking of a Maranta among the diamonds of light of a borrowed house. The last known veterans were portrayed in a newspaper, their faces raised in indignity. The others, the most worthy, were still waiting for a letter in the twilight of public charity, starving, surviving with rage, rotting from old age in the exquisite shit of glory. So when Colonel Orleano Buendia invited him to promote a deadly conflagration that would wipe out all vestiges of a regime of corruption and scandal sustained by the foreign invader, Colonel Gabriel Márquez could not repress a shudder of compassion. "Oh, Orleano," he sighed, "I already knew you were old, but now I realize you're much older than you seem." In the bewilderment of recent years, Ursula had had very few respites to attend to the papal formation of José Arcadio, when he had to be prepared on the fly to go to the seminary. Mime, her sister, divided between Fernanda's rigidity and Amaranta's bitterness, arrived almost at the same time at the age scheduled to send her to the nuns' school where they would make her a harpsichord virtuoso. "The years now don't come like they used to," she used to say, feeling that everyday reality was slipping out of her hands. Before, she thought, children took a long time to grow up. The truth was that Ursula resisted growing old even though she had already lost count of her age, and she was in the way everywhere, and tried to get into everything, and annoyed the strangers with questions about whether they had left the house, for the times of the war, a plaster St. Joseph to be kept while the rain passed. No one knew for sure when she began to lose her sight. Even in her last years, when she could no longer get out of bed, she simply seemed to be overcome by decrepitude, but no one discovered that she was blind. She had noticed it since before Jose Arcadio was born. She didn't tell anyone, as it would have been a public acknowledgement of her worthlessness. She insisted on a silent learning of the distances of things, and of the voices of people, to continue seeing with her memory when the shadows of the falls no longer allowed her. She had to discover the unforeseen help of odors. In the dark of the room she could thread the needle and knit a buttonhole, and she knew when the milk was about to boil. She knew with such certainty the place where everything was, that she herself sometimes forgot that she was blind. Simply, while the others were carelessly wandering around, she watched them with her four senses so that they would never take her by surprise, and after some time she discovered that each member of the family repeated the same things every day, without realizing it. Roots, the same acts, and that he almost repeated the same words at the same time. Only when they got out of that meticulous routine did they risk losing something. So when she heard Fernanda being dismayed because she had lost her ring, Ursula remembered that the only thing different that she had done that day was to put the sun on the children's mats because Meme had discovered a bedbug the night before. Since the children attended the cleanup, Ursula thought that Fernanda had put the ring in the only place where they couldn't reach it, the shelf. Fernanda, on the other hand, looked for it only on the paths of her daily itinerary, without knowing that the search for lost things is hampered by routine habits, and that is why it is so difficult to find them. However, in the impenetrable solitude of decrepitude, she disposed of such clairvoyance to examine even the most insignificant events in the family, that for the first time she clearly saw the truths that her previous occupations had prevented her from seeing. By the time they were preparing Jose Arcadio for the seminary, he had already made an infinitesimal recapitulation of the life of the house since the founding of Macondo, and had completely changed the opinion he had always had of his descendants. She realized that Colonel Orleano Buendia had not lost love for the family because of the hardening of the war, as she had previously believed, but that he had never loved anyone, not even his wife Remedios or the countless women of a night that passed through his life, much less his children. He glimpsed that he had not waged so many wars out of idealism, as everyone believed, nor had he renounced imminent victory out of weariness, as everyone believed, but that he had won and lost for the same reason, out of pure and sinful pride. He was simply a man incapable of love. One night, when he was in the womb, he heard him cry. The lucidity of decrepitude allowed him to see that the crying of children in the mother's womb is not an announcement of ventriloquism or divinatory faculty, but an unequivocal sign of incapacity for love. That devaluation of the image of her son suddenly aroused in him all the compassion that she owed him. Amaranta, on the other hand, whose hardness of heart frightened her, whose concentrated bitterness made her bitter, she revealed to him in the last examination as the most tender woman who had ever existed. Rather, both actions had been a fight to the death between a love without measures and an invincible cowardice, and the irrational fear that Amaranta had always had of her own and her tormented heart had finally triumphed. It was around that time that Ursula began to name Rebecca, to evoke her with an old affection exalted by her belated repentance and sudden admiration, because she was the only one who had the unbridled courage that Ursula had desired for her lineage. "Rebecca," she said, feeling the walls, "how unfair we have been to you." Her own experience was beginning to tell her that an alert old age can be more accurate than guessing at cards. However, when Ursula realized that she had not had enough time to consolidate Jose Arcadio's vocation, she allowed herself to be stunned by her consternation. She began to make mistakes, trying to see with her eyes the things that her intuition allowed her to see more clearly. She caused so many stumbles with the stubbornness to intervene in all of her, that she felt upset by bursts of bad humor, and she tried to remove the darkness that was finally entangling her like a nightgown of cobwebs. It was then that it occurred to her that her clumsiness was not the first victory of decrepitude and darkness, but a failure of time. Not only were children growing faster now, but even feelings evolved differently. As soon as Remedios the beauty had ascended to heaven body and soul, the inconsiderate Fernanda was already grumbling in the corners because she had taken the sheets. As soon as the bodies of the Orleanos had cooled in their tombs, and Orleano Segundo already had the house on fire again. And as if that madhouse that had cost so many headaches and so many candy animals, was predestined to become a dump of perdition. Recalling these things while they packed Jose Arcadio's trunk, Ursula wondered if it wasn't preferable to lie down once and for all in the grave and have the earth thrown over her, and she asked God, without fear, if he really believed that the people were made of iron to withstand so many pains and mortifications, and asking he was stirring up his own obfuscation. And he felt an irrepressible desire to break free to rant like a foreigner, and to finally allow himself a moment of rebellion, to put resignation in the foundation and shed once and for all, and get out of his heart the infinite heaps of bad words that he had had to choke on a century of conformity. "Damn!" he yelled. Amaranta, who was beginning to put the clothes in the trunk, thought she had been stung by a scorpion. "Where is the?" she asked in alarm. "What?" "The animal." Amaranth clarified. Ursula put a finger to her heart. "Here," she said. One Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, Jose Arcadio went to the seminary. Ursula would always evoke him as she imagined him when she said goodbye, languid and serious and without shedding a tear, as she had taught him. But when the velvet-lined trunk with silver corners was taken away, it was as if a coffin had been carried out of the house. The only one who refused to participate in the farewell was Colonel Orleano Buendia. 3 months later, Orleano Segundo and Fernanda took Mime to school, and they returned with a harpsichord that took the place of the player piano. It was around that time that Amaranta began to weave her own shroud. The banana fever had subsided. In the house they continued receiving guests for lunch, and in reality the old routine was not restored until the banana company left, years later. However, there were radical changes in the traditional sense of hospitality, because then it was Fernanda who imposed her laws. With Ursula relegated to darkness, and with Amaranta absorbed in the work of the shroud, the former apprentice queen was free to select the guests and impose the rigid rules that her parents instilled in her. Her severity made the house a redoubt of corrupt customs, in a town convulsed by the vulgarity with which outsiders squandered their easy fortunes. For her, without further ado, good people were those who had nothing to do with the banana company. The narrowness imposed in the house was such that Orleano Segundo felt definitely more comfortable with petticoats. When Fernanda realized that she was a widow whose husband had not yet died, it was already too late for things to return to their previous state. One night, by inadvertence, the morning caught him in petticoats' bed. Fernanda, contrary to what he expected, did not reproach her in the slightest or let out the slightest sigh of resentment from her, but that same day she sent her 2 trunks of clothes to her concubine's house. She sent them out in the sun and with instructions to take them down the middle of the street for all the world to see, believing that the wayward husband could not bear the shame and would return to the fold with a humbled head. But everyone who saw the trunks go by said that, after all, that was the natural culmination of a story whose intimacies no one was unaware of, and Orleano Segundo celebrated the freedom he had been given with a 3-day party. To the wife's further disadvantage, as she began to make a bad come of age in her somber tailor garments, the concubine seemed to burst into a second youth. Orleano Segundo gave himself to her again with the ardor of adolescence. She was then seen more partying and rowdy than ever. On the train, which arrived every day at 11, he received boxes and boxes of champagne and brandy. He never had a better countenance, nor did they love him more, nor was he more outrageous in the delivery room of his animals. So many cattle, so many pigs and chickens were sacrificed in the endless parandas, that the earth of the patio turned black and muddy with so much blood. Orleano Segundo became fat, purplish, torpid, as a result of an appetite hardly comparable to that of José Arcadio when he returned from traveling around the world. The prestige of his unrestrained voracity, his immense capacity for extravagance, his unprecedented hospitality, went beyond the limits of the swamp and attracted the best qualified gluttons of the coast. Fabulous swallowers came from everywhere to take part in the irrational tournaments of ability and endurance that were organized at Petricote's house. Orleano Segundo was the undefeated eater, until the unlucky Saturday when Camila Sagastume appeared, a totemic female known throughout the country with the good name of La Elefanta. The duel lasted until dawn on Tuesday. In the first 24 hours, having dispatched a veal with cassava, yams, and roasted plantains, plus a case and a half of champagne. While Orleano Segundo ate with his teeth, out of control with the anxiety of triumph, La Elefanta sectioned the meat with the skills of a surgeon, and ate it slowly and even with a certain pleasure. She was gigantic and massive, but against her colossal corpulence the tenderness of femininity prevailed, and she had such a beautiful face, such fine and well-groomed hands, and such an irresistible personal charm, that when Orleano Segundo saw her enter the house he whispered that he would have preferred not to do the tournament at the table but in bed. Later, when he saw her consume the calf's rump without violating a single rule of the best civility, he seriously commented that this delicate, fascinating and insatiable proboscid was in a way the ideal woman. She was the director of a singing academy. She had learned to eat while she was already a respectable mother of a family, looking for a method so that her children could eat better and not through artificial stimuli of appetite but through absolute peace of mind. Her theory, demonstrated in practice, was based on the principle that a person who had perfectly arranged all the matters of her conscience could eat without respite until exhaustion overcame her. From the first time she saw him, she realized that Orleano Segundo would not lose his stomach but rather her character. At the end of the first night, while La Elefanta continued impassively, Orleano Segundo was exhausting himself from talking and laughing so much. They slept 4 hours. Upon awakening, he each drank the juice of 50 oranges, 8 liters of coffee, and 30 raw eggs. At the second sunrise, after many hours without sleep and having dispatched 2 pigs, a bunch of bananas and 4 cases of champagne. When Petricotes brought 2 roast turkeys to the table, Orleano Segundo was 1 step away from congestion. "If you can't, don't eat any more," said the elephant. "We are tied." She said it from her heart, realizing that she couldn't eat another bite either because of the remorse of causing the death of her adversary. But Orleano Segundo interpreted it as a new challenge, and he choked on turkey beyond his incredible capacity. He lost consciousness. He fell face down into the plate of bones, foaming like a dog at the mouth, and choking on snoring in agony. He felt, in the midst of the darkness, that he was being thrown from the top of a tower towards a bottomless precipice, and in a last flash of lucidity he realized that at the end of that endless fall death was waiting for him. "Take me to Fernanda," he managed to say. But Orleano Segundo was out of danger. He did indeed recover in less than a week, and a fortnight later he was celebrating the survival event with an unprecedented shindig. He continued to live in Petra Coates's house, but he visited Fernanda every day and sometimes he stayed to eat with the family, as if fate had reversed the situation, and had left him as the husband of the concubine and as the lover of the wife. It was a break for Fernanda. Fernanda wandered alone among 3 living ghosts and the dead ghost of José Arcadio Buendia, who sometimes would sit with inquisitive attention in the shadows of the room while she played the harpsichord. Colonel Orleano Buendia was a shadow. Since the last time he went out into the street to propose a war without a future to Colonel Gabriel Márquez, he hardly left the workshop to urinate under the chestnut tree. He ate whatever Ursula brought him once a day, and although he continued to make goldfish with the same passion as before, he stopped selling them when he found out that people didn't buy them as jewelry but as historical relics. Amaranta wove her shroud. Fernanda didn't understand why she wrote occasional letters to Mime, and she even sent her gifts, and instead she didn't even want to talk about José Arcadio. They will die without knowing why. Amaranta seemed to carry on her forehead the cross of ashes of her virginity. She actually carried it in her hand, in the black bandage that she did not take off even to sleep. She would have said that she embroidered during the day and overflowed at night, and not with the hope of defeating loneliness in that way, but quite the opposite, to sustain it. Fernanda's greatest concern during the years of her abandonment was that Mime would spend her first vacation and not find Orleano Segundo at her house. When Mime returned, her parents had agreed not only so that the girl would believe that Orleano Segundo was still a domesticated husband, but also so that she would not notice the sadness in the house. Every year, for 2 months, Orleano Segundo played the role of her exemplary husband. It seemed more like a second version of Amaranta, when she did not know bitterness and was stirring up the house with her dance steps, at 12, at 14, before the secret passion for Pietro Crespi definitively twisted the course of her heart. But Mime still did not reveal the solitary fate of the family, and she seemed entirely at ease with the world. The first sign of that calamitous inheritance was revealed on the 3rd vacation, when Mime appeared at the house with 4 nuns and 68 classmates, whom she invited to spend a week with her family, on her own initiative and without any announcement. What a misfortune! Fernanda lamented. This creature is as barbaric as her father. The invitation was a failure, because the noisy schoolgirls had barely finished breakfast when they had to start shifts for lunch, and then for dinner, and in the whole week they could only take 1 trip to the plantations. On the night of their arrival, the students got so tangled up trying to go to the bathroom before bed that at 1 in the morning they were still the last ones coming in. When they finally left, the flowers were shattered, the furniture smashed, and the walls covered with drawings and signs, but Fernanda forgave them the ravages of their departure relief. She kept the 72 bedpans in Melchiad's room. The enclosed room, around which the spiritual life of the house once revolved, has since been known as the potty room. Around those days, José Arcadio Segundo reappeared in the house. He passed by along the corridor, without greeting anyone, and shut himself up in the workshop to talk with the colonel. Even though she couldn't see him, Ursula studied the click of his foreman's boots and was surprised at the insurmountable distance that separated him from the family. He was linear, solemn, and had a pensiveness, and a Saracen sadness, and a gloomy glow on his autumn-colored face. He was the one who most resembled his mother, Santa Sofia de la Piedad. He did not have a fixed residence, he raised roosters at Pilar Turner's house, and sometimes he stayed there to sleep, but he almost always spent the night in the rooms of the French matrons. In reality, José Arcadio Segundo was not a member of the family, nor would he ever be of another, since the distant dawn when Colonel Gabriel Márquez took him to the barracks, not so that he would see a shooting, but so that he would not forget in the rest of his life the sad and slightly mocking smile of the executed man. That was not only his oldest memory of him, but the only one from his childhood. The other, that of an old man in an anachronistic waistcoat and a raven-winged hat, telling wonders in front of a dazzling window, he couldn't place it in any era. The memory of the executed man returned to his memory more and more clearly as he grew older, as if the passage of time had brought him closer. He was as insensitive to his pleas as the colonel could have been, and that they were armored by the same imperviousness to affection. The truth is that not even José Arcadio Segundo could have gotten the colonel out of his prison. The school invasion had exceeded the limits of his patience. He became more and more hardened since Colonel Gabriel Márquez refused to support him in a senile war. He locked himself inside himself, and the family ended up thinking of him as if he had died. No human reaction was seen from him again, until one October 11th, when he went out to the street door to watch a circus parade. At 5 in the morning he was awakened by the racket of toads and crickets outside the wall. Then he put the blanket over his head, and went to urinate in the patio. On his way back to the workshop, he smelled the wick smelling from the stoves that Santa Sofia de la Piedad was lighting, and he waited in the kitchen for the coffee to boil before taking his mug without sugar. He suddenly remembered that one October 11th, in the middle of the war, he was awakened by the brutal certainty that the woman he had slept with was dead. In the emptiness of so many women who came into his life in the same way, he did not remember that it was she who, in the delirium of the first meeting, was about to drown in her own tears, and barely an hour before she died she had sworn to love him to death. Death. He didn't think about her again, or about any other of hers, after he entered the workshop with the steaming cup, and turned on the light to count the little gold fishes that he kept in a tin jar. There were 17. Since he decided not to sell them, he kept making 2 little fishes a day, and when he completed 25 he would melt them back in the crucible to start making them again. At the end of lunch he experienced the anxiety of idleness. So he lay down in the hammock. He dreamed that he entered an empty house, with white walls, and that he was disturbed by the sadness of being the first human being to enter it. In the dream he remembered that he had dreamed the same thing the night before. That recurring dream had the virtue of not being remembered except within the same dream. A moment later, in fact, when the barber knocked on the door of the workshop, Colonel Orleano Buendia woke up with the impression that he had involuntarily fallen asleep for a few seconds, and that he had not had time to dream anything. That memory, like all those of recent years, took him without him thinking about the war. Then he drifted to scattered episodes, but he recalled them without qualifying them, because by dint of not being able to think of anything else he had learned to think cold, so that the inescapable memories of him would not hurt any feelings. Back at the workshop, he started the second little fish of the day. He realized that he wanted to urinate, and was putting it off until he finished assembling the little fish. He was going to the patio at 4:10 when he heard the distant brass, the rumbling of the bass drum and the jubilation of the children, and for the first time since his youth he consciously stepped on a nostalgia trap, and relived the prodigious gypsy afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. Instead of going to the chestnut tree, Colonel Orleano Buendia also went to the street door and mingled with the onlookers who were watching the parade. He saw a woman dressed in gold on the back of an elephant. He saw a sad camel. He saw a bear dressed as a Dutch woman beating the beat of the music with a ladle and a saucepan. He saw the clowns doing somersaults in the parade queue, and he saw the face of his miserable loneliness again when everything was over, and there was nothing left but the luminous space in the street. So he went to the chestnut tree, thinking about the circus, and while he was urinating he tried to keep thinking about the circus, but he no longer found the memory. He put his head between his shoulders, like a chicken, and stood motionless with his forehead resting on the trunk of the chestnut tree. The family did not find out until the next day, at 11 in the morning, when Santa Sofia de la Piedad went to throw the garbage in her backyard and was struck by the fact that the buzzards were coming down. Mim's last vacations coincided with the morning for the death of Colonel Orleano Buendia. In the closed house there was no room for parties. They spoke in whispers, they ate in silence, they prayed the rosary 3 times a day. Orleano II went back to sleep at home as usual while his daughter's vacations passed, and Fernanda must have done something to recover her privileges as legitimate wife, because the following year Mim found a newborn little sister, whom they baptized, against her will. Of the mother, with the name of Amaranta Ursula. Mim had finished her studies. Her diploma accrediting her as a concert harpsichord player was ratified by the virtuosity with which she performed popular themes of the 17th century. The guests admired, more than her art, her rare duality. Her frivolous and even a little childish character of hers did not seem suitable for any serious activity, but when she sat down at the harpsichord she transformed into a different girl, whose unforeseen maturity gave her an air of adulthood. That's how it always was. She really did not have a definite vocation, but she had achieved the highest grades for her through uncompromising discipline, so as not to upset her mother. They could have imposed on him the apprenticeship of any other trade and the results would have been the same. From a very young age, Fernanda's strictness bothered her, her habit of deciding for others, and she would have been capable of a much harder sacrifice than the harpsichord lessons, just not to trip over her intransigence. She believed that from then on neither she nor stubborn Fernanda would worry about an instrument that even the nuns considered a museum fossil. In the first years, he believed that his calculations were wrong, because after having slept halfway through the city, not only in the visiting room, but also in all the charity evenings, school sessions, and patriotic commemorations that were held in Macondo, his mother continued to invite everyone arrived that he supposed capable of appreciating the virtues of the daughter. Only after Amaranta's death, when the family shut themselves up again for a time in mourning, was Mim able to close the harpsichord and forget the key in any wardrobe, without Fernanda bothering to find out when or by whom. Had missed. Mim she resisted exhibitions with the same stoicism with which she devoted herself to learning. It was the price of her freedom. Fernanda was so pleased with her docility and so proud of her admiration for her art that she never objected to her having a house full of friends and spending the afternoon in the plantations. In those moments of relaxation the true tastes of the discipline were revealed, in the noisy parties, in the prolonged confinement with their friends, where they learned to smoke and talked about men's affairs, and where once they passed the hand with 3 bottles of cane rum and ended up naked, measuring each other and comparing their body parts. She would never forget the night she came into the house chewing licorice rhizomes. She had spent 2 tremendous hours in a friend's bedroom, crying with laughter and fear, and on the other side of the crisis she had found the rare feeling of courage it took to sneak out of school and tell her mother with those words. In other words, he could well put on a harpsichord enema. Then saw Fernanda and Amaranta wrapped in the accusing halo of reality. She had to make a great effort not to blame their squeamishness, their poverty of spirit, her delusions of grandeur. Since the second vacation she had found out that her father only lived in the house to keep up appearances, and knowing Fernanda as she knew her and having managed later to meet Petricotes, she agreed with Fernanda. Her father? She, too, would have preferred to be the concubine's daughter. In the days of alcohol, thought with delight of the scandal that would have arisen if she had expressed her thoughts at that moment, and the intimate satisfaction of mischief was so intense that Fernanda noticed it. "What's wrong?" She asked. "Nothing," she answered "That only now I discover how much I love them." She forced her to comply with the diet and the confinement of 5 days, had no other recourse but to endure. Ursula, now completely blind but still active and lucid, was the only one who guessed the exact diagnosis. "To me," she thought, "these are the same things they give drunks." Orleano Segundo felt a pang of conscience when he saw Mim's prostrate state, and he promised himself that he would take more care of her in the future. That was how the relationship of joyful camaraderie was born between her father and her daughter, which freed him for a time from the bitter loneliness of partying, and freed her from Fernanda's tutelage. The discovery of her daughter restored to him her old joviality, and the pleasure of being with her gradually drew him away from her dissipation. Stood out in a fruitful age. She was not beautiful, as Amaranta never was, but instead she was nice, uncomplicated, and she had the virtue of being liked from the first moment. It was he who decided to get her out of the bedroom she had occupied since she was a child, and where the fearful eyes of the saints continued to feed her adolescent terrors, and he furnished her a room with a throne-size bed, a large dressing table and velvet curtains, without realizing it. That he was doing a second version of Petricote's bedroom. Mim's room was filled with such innovative cosmetics and beauty artifacts that every time Fernanda entered the bedroom she was scandalized by the idea that her daughter's dressing table should be the same as that of French matrons. However, Fernanda was at that time divided between little Amaranta Ursula, who was capricious and sickly, and an exciting correspondence with the invisible doctors. So when she realized her father's complicity with her daughter, the only promise she extracted from Orleano Segundo was that he would never take Mim to Petricote's house. It was a meaningless warning, because the concubine was so upset with her lover's camaraderie with her daughter that he wanted nothing to do with her. He was tormented by an unknown fear, as if her instinct told her that Mim, just by wishing for him, could achieve what Fernanda could not, deprive her of a love that she already considered guaranteed until her death. Petricotes was determined to win her husband back by sharpening the only weapons with which she could not dispute her daughter. It was also an unnecessary effort, because Mim never intended to intervene in her father's affairs. She didn't have time to bother anyone. She herself swept the bedroom and made the bed, as the nuns taught her. While the others took their siesta, she practiced the harpsichord for 2 hours, knowing that her daily sacrifice would keep Fernanda calm. If she didn't have something to do with her father, she went to friends' houses, where she stayed until dinner time. Among Mim's friends were 3 young American women who broke through the fence of the electrified chicken coop and established friendships with girls from Macondo. One of them was Patricia Brown. Grateful for Orleano Segundo's hospitality, Mr. Brown opened the doors of her house to Mim and invited her to the Saturday dances, which were the only ones in which the gringos alternated with the natives. When Fernanda found out, she forgot about Amaranta Ursula and the invisible doctors for a moment, and she put together a whole melodrama. "Imagine," she told Mim, "what the colonel is going to think at his grave." She was looking, of course, for Ursula's support. But the blind old woman, contrary to what everyone expected, considered that there was nothing wrong with Mim attending dances and cultivating friendships with American women of her age, as long as she maintained her firm judgment and did not allow herself to be converted by the Protestant religion. Fernanda's opposition resisted until the day Mim disarmed her with the news that the North Americans wanted to hear her play her harpsichord. Where indeed the young soloist received the most sincere applause and the most enthusiastic congratulations from her. Since then she was not only invited to her dances, but also to Sunday swims in the pool, and to lunch once a week. She learned to swim like a pro, play tennis and eat Virginia ham with pineapple slices. Between dances, pool, and tennis, she suddenly found herself unraveling in English. Orleano Segundo bought her an English encyclopedia in 6 volumes and with numerous colored plates, which she read in her spare time. Her reading occupied the attention that she had previously devoted to the gossip of lovers or to experimental lockdowns with her friends. She remembered the drunkenness as a childhood adventure, and it seemed so funny to her that she told Orleano Segundo about it, and he thought it was more fun than she did. He had made her promise that with the same confidence she would inform him of her first courtship, and she had told him that she liked a red-headed American who went to spend vacations with her parents. But she, Meme, also told him that the boy had returned to his country and had not shown any signs of life. His maturity of criteria strengthened domestic peace. Orleano Segundo then dedicated more hours to Petricoats, and although her body and soul no longer gave him time for partying like before, he did not miss an opportunity to promote them and draw his accordion. In the house, Amaranta embroidered her endless shroud, and Ursula allowed herself to be dragged by decrepitude towards the bottom of the darkness, where the only thing that was still visible was the ghost of José Arcadio Buendia under the chestnut tree. Fernanda consolidated her authority. Her monthly letters to her son, José Arcadio, then did not contain a line of lies, and she only hid her correspondence with the invisible doctors, who had diagnosed her with a benign tumor in her large intestine and were preparing her for it. To perform a telepathic intervention. It would have been said that in the tired Buendia mansion there was routine peace and happiness for a long time if Amaranta's untimely death had not caused a new scandal. It was an unexpected event. Although she was old and isolated from everyone, she still looked firm and straight, and in the rock health she always had. Nobody knew her thoughts since the afternoon when she definitively rejected Colonel Gabriel Márquez and shut herself up to cry. When she came out of it, she had exhausted all her tears. He was not seen crying when Remedios the Beauty ascended to heaven, nor with the extermination of the Orleanos, nor with the death of Colonel Orleano Buendia, who was the person he loved most in this world, although he was only able to prove it when they found him. His corpse under the chestnut tree. She helped lift the body. She dressed him in her warrior's trappings, shaved him, combed his hair, and glued his mustache better than he himself didn't in his glory years. No one thought there was love in that act, because they were used to Amaranta's familiarity with the rites of death. Fernanda was scandalized that she did not understand the relationship between Catholicism and life, but only her relationship with death, as if it were not a religion, but a prospect of funerary conventions. Ella Amaranta was too entangled in the eggplant of her memories to understand those apologetic subtleties. She had reached old age with all her vivid nostalgia. When she listened to Pietro Crespi's waltzes she felt the same desire to cry that she had in adolescence. The reels of music that she herself had thrown away, under the pretext that they were rotting in the damp, continued to spin and hit hammers in her memory. He had tried to plunge them into the swampy passion that he allowed himself with his nephew Orleano José, and he had tried to take refuge in the serene and virile protection of Colonel Gabriel Márquez, but he had not been able to defeat them even with the most desperate act of his old age, when he bathed little José Arcadio 3 years before they sent him to the seminary, and caressed him not as a grandmother could with a grandson, but as a woman would have done with a man. Sometimes it hurt her to have left that trail of misery in her wake, and sometimes it made her so angry that she pricked her fingers with the needles, but it hurt her more and made her more angry and bitter at the fragrant and wormy guayabal of love that was dragging towards death. Just as Colonel Orleano Buendia thought about the war, without being able to avoid it, Amaranta thought about Rebecca. But while her brother had managed to sterilize her memories, she had only managed to scald them. The only thing she prayed to God for many years was that she not send her the punishment of dying before Rebecca. Every time she passed by her house and noticed the progress of the destruction she took pleasure in the idea that God was listening to her. She was waiting for them to bring her the news of Rebecca's death. No one in the house noticed that Amaranta then wove a beautiful shroud for Rebecca. Later, when Orleano Triste recounted that he had seen her turned into an apparition image of her, with cracked skin and a few yellowish strands on her skull. He had decided to restore Rebecca's corpse, hide the ravages on her face with paraffin, and make a wig out of the hair of the saints. She would make a beautiful corpse, with a linen shroud and a plush-lined coffin trimmed with purple, and make it available to the worms at a lavish funeral. The only thing she did not take into account in her tremendous plan was that, despite her prayers to God, she could die before Rebecca. That's how it happened, in fact. But in her final moment, Amaranta did not feel frustrated, but on the contrary, freed from all bitterness, because her death gave her the privilege of announcing herself several years in advance. He saw her one hot noon, sewing with her in the corridor, shortly after Meme left for school. He recognized her instantly, and there was nothing scary about her death, because she was a woman dressed in blue with long hair, looking a little old-fashioned. Several times Fernanda was present and she did not see her, even though she was so real, so human. Her death did not tell him when she was going to die or if her hour was set before Rebecca's, but she ordered him to start weaving her own shroud on the 6th of April next. He authorized her to make it as complicated and exquisite as she wanted, but as honestly as she did Rebecca's, and he warned her that she would die without pain, fear, or bitterness, at nightfall of the day she finished it. Trying to waste as much time as possible, Amaranta ordered the bile linen threads and made the canvas herself. She did it with such care that this work alone took her 4 years. She began the embroidery. As she approached the inescapable term, she began to understand that only a miracle would allow her to prolong the work beyond Rebecca's death, but the same concentration gave her the calm she needed to accept the idea of frustration. It was then that she understood the vicious circle of Colonel Orleano Buendia's little gold fishes. The world was reduced to the surface of her skin, and the inside of her was safe from all bitterness. It pained him not to have had that revelation many years before, when it was still possible to purify memories and reconstruct the universe in a new light, and to evoke without flinching the smell of lavender from Pietro Crespi at sunset, and to rescue Rebecca from her sauce of misery. Not out of hate or love, but out of understanding without measures of loneliness. The hatred that she noticed one night in Mime's words did not move her because it affected her, but because she felt repeated in another adolescence that seemed as clean as hers should have seemed and that, however, was already vitiated by the resentment of she. But then her agreement with her destiny was so deep that she was not even disturbed by the certainty that all possibilities of rectification were closed to her. Her only goal was to finish the shroud. Instead of slowing her down with useless prettiness, as she did at first, she hastened the work. On the night of February 4th, a storm destroyed the power plant. But the next day, at 8 o'clock in the morning, she put the last stitch in the most exquisite work that any woman had ever finished, and she announced without the slightest drama that she would die at sunset. She not only warned the family, but the entire population, because Amaranta had made up her mind that a life of meanness could be repaired with one last favor to the world, and she thought that none was better than taking letters to the dead. At 3 in the afternoon there was a drawer full of letters in the living room. It seemed like a farce. Ella Amaranta did not reveal any disorder, nor the slightest sign of pain. Ursula, with the experience that the Buendias died without illness, did not doubt that Amaranta had had the omen of death. At 4 in the afternoon Amaranta had just distributed her belongings among the poor, and she had only left on the severe coffin of rough boards the change of clothes and the simple corduroy slippers that she would have to wear in death. Shortly before 5 o'clock, Orleano II went to pick up Mime for the concert, and was surprised that the house was ready for her funeral. If anyone seemed alive at that hour, it was the serene Amaranta, who had enough time to slice off her tripe. Orleano II and her Mime said goodbye to her with mocking goodbyes, and promised her that the following Saturday they would make a party for her resurrection. Father Antonio Isabel arrived at 5 o'clock with the viaticum. He thought, however, to take advantage of the occasion to confess to Amaranta after almost 20 years of reluctance. Fernanda was shocked. Without taking care not to be heard, she wondered aloud what awful sin Amaranta had committed when she preferred a sacrilegious death to the shame of a confession. Then Amaranta went to bed and forced Ursula to give public testimony of her virginity. "Let no one get their hopes up," she shouted, so that Fernanda could hear her. "Amaranta Buendia leaves this world as she came." She didn't get up again. Lying on pillows, as if she really were sick, she weaved her long braids and looped them over her ears, as her death had told her she must be in her coffin. She then asked Ursula for a mirror, and for the first time in over 40 years she saw her face devastated by age and her martyrdom, and she was amazed at how much she resembled the mental image she had of herself. Ursula understood from the silence in the bedroom that it had begun to get dark. "Say goodbye to Fernanda," he begged her. "A minute of reconciliation has more merit than a lifetime of friendship." "It's not worth it anymore," replied Amaranta. Mime could not think of her when they turned on the lights of the improvised stage and the second part of the program began. Halfway through the piece someone whispered the news in his ear, and the act was suspended. The corpse of the old maiden, ugly and discolored, with the black bandage on her hand and wrapped in the exquisite shroud. Ursula did not get up again after Amaranta's 9 nights. Santa Sofia de la Piedad took care of her. She managed to arouse great affection in little Amaranta Ursula, who was identical to her, and whom she taught to read. She then had so much time and so much inner silence to watch the life of the house, that she was the first to notice Mime's silent tribulation. "Come here," he told her. "Now that we are alone, confess to this poor old woman what is happening to you." Mime dodged the conversation with a shaky laugh. Ursula did not insist, but she finished confirming her suspicions when Mime did not visit her again. She knew that she got ready earlier than usual, that she did not have a moment of peace while she waited for the time to go out. Mime herself was then so self-absorbed that she accused Ursula of having denounced her. She actually denounced herself. For a long time she had left behind her a trail of clues that would have awakened the most asleep, and if Fernanda took so long to discover them, it was because she was also clouded by her secret relationships with the invisible doctors. One night, Mime announced that she was going to the movies with her father. She then got dressed, went into the movie theater, and in the gloom of the lunettes she recognized her daughter. The stunning emotion of success prevented her from seeing the man with whom she was kissing, took Mime out of the living room without saying a word, and subjected her to the embarrassment of taking her through the bustling street of the Turks, and locked her in the bedroom. The next day, at 6 in the afternoon, Fernanda recognized the voice of the man who came to visit her. He was young, sallow, with dark, brooding eyes. For Fernanda, however, seeing him once was enough to intuit his status as a craftsman. She realized that she was wearing her only Sunday outfit, and that under her shirt her skin was eaten away by the scabies from the banana company. She did not allow him to speak. She didn't even allow him to pass the door, which a moment later she had to close because the house was full of yellow butterflies. "Go away," he told her. "Nothing has to come looking for decent people." His name was Mauricio Babylonia. He had been born and raised in Macondo, and was an apprentice mechanic in the workshops of the banana company. Meme had met him by chance, one afternoon when she went with Patricia Brown to get the car for a drive through the plantations. She would later remember that during the walk she was struck by his masculine beauty, except for the brutality of his hands. The first Saturday that she went to the movies with her father, she saw Mauricio Babylonia again. In the end, Mauricio Babylonia approached to greet Orleano Segundo, and only then did Meme find out that they knew each other, because he had worked in the primitive Orleano Triste power plant, and treated his father with the attitude of a subordinate. They had not seen each other alone, nor had they exchanged a word other than the greeting, the night she dreamed that he saved her from a shipwreck, and she did not experience a feeling of gratitude but of rage. It was like having given him an opportunity that he wanted, while Meme yearned for the opposite, not only with Mauricio Babylonia, but with any other man who was interested in her. That is why she was so incensed that after her dream, instead of hating him, she would have experienced an irresistible urge to see him. The following Saturday, dazed by a confused sensation of pleasure and anger, she held out her hand to him for the first time, and only then did Mauricio Babylonia allow himself to shake it. She understood that night that she would not have a moment of calm until she showed Mauricio Babylonia the vanity of her aspiration, and she spent the week fluttering around that anxiety. Lastly, she made use of the red-headed North American who was going to spend vacations in Macondo at that time, and under the pretext of learning about the new car models, she had herself taken to the workshops. From the moment she saw him, Meme stopped deceiving herself, and understood that what was really happening was that she couldn't bear the desire to be alone with Mauricio Babylonia, and she was outraged by the certainty that he had done it. Understood when he saw her arrive. "I came to see the new models," she said. "Meme." "It's a good excuse," he said. "Don't be scared," she told him in a low voice. "It's not the first time a woman has gone crazy over a man." She felt so helpless that she left the workshop without seeing the new models, and she spent the night from end to end tossing and turning in bed and crying with indignation. It was then that she became aware of the yellow butterflies that preceded the appearances of Mauricio Babylonia. But when Mauricio Babylonia began to chase her, like a specter that only she could identify in the crowd, she understood that the yellow butterflies had something to do with him. Mauricio Babylonia was always in the audience at concerts, at the movies, at high mass, and she didn't need to see him to find out, because the butterflies told her so. One morning, while they were pruning the roses, Fernanda uttered a cry of fright and had Meme removed from the place where she was, and which was the same from the garden where Remedios the beauty ascended to heaven. She had had for an instant the impression that the miracle was going to be repeated in her daughter, because she had been disturbed by a sudden flutter of wings. They were the butterflies. Meme saw them, as if they had been suddenly born into the light, and her heart skipped a beat. At that moment, Mauricio Babylonia entered with a package that, according to what he said, was a gift from Patricia Brown. The only thing that Fernanda noticed in the man that she had to expel from the house a few months later without remembering that she had ever seen him was the bilious texture of his skin. "He is a very strange man," she said. Fernanda. "She sees in his face that he is going to die." It was a kind of Chinese toy, made up of 5 concentric boxes, and in the last one a card, "See you on Saturday at the movies." On her Saturday, she convinced her father to leave her alone in the theater and come back for her after the performance. When the lights went out, Mauricio Babylonia sat down next to her. "If he hadn't come," he said, "he would never have seen me again. What strikes me about you," she smiled, "is that you always say precisely the wrong thing." She went crazy for him. She lost her sleep and her appetite, and she sank so deeply into loneliness that even her father became a hindrance to her. She elaborated an intricate tangle of false commitments to disorient Fernanda, she lost sight of her friends, she jumped over conventions to see Mauricio Babylonia at any time and anywhere. At first she resented her rudeness. It took her some time to realize that this was also a form of tenderness, and it was then that she lost her calm, and she lived only for him. Shortly before Amaranta's death, she suddenly stumbled upon a space of lucidity within madness, and she trembled before the uncertainty of the future. She then heard about a woman who was making deck forecasts, and went to visit her secretly. She was Pilar Ternera. Since she saw her enter, she knew Meme's recondite motives. "Sit down," she told him. I don't need cards to find out the future of a Buendia. Meme did not know, and she always did not know, that this 100-year-old fortune-teller was her great-grandmother. She, too, would not have believed it after the aggressive realism with which she revealed to him that the anxiety of falling in love with her found no rest except in her bed. She thought then that love in one way defeated love in another way, because it was in the nature of men to repudiate hunger once appetite had been satisfied. Pilar Ternera not only dispelled the error, but also offered him the old canvas bed where she conceived Arcadio, Meme's grandfather, and where she later conceived Orleano Jose. She further taught him how to prevent undesirable conception by vaporizing mustard poultices. That interview she instilled in Meme the same feeling of bravery that she experienced the afternoon of the drunkenness. Amaranta's death, however, forced her to postpone her decision. While the 9 nights lasted, she did not leave Mauricio Babylonia for a moment. Then came the prolonged mourning and compulsory confinement, and they separated for a while. The first afternoon that Meme managed to get out, he went directly to Pilar Ternera's house. She gave herself to Mauricio Babylonia without resistance, without modesty, without formalities. They made love twice a week for more than 3 months, protected by the innocent complicity of Orleano II. The night that Fernanda surprised them at the movies, Orleano II felt overwhelmed by the weight of his conscience, and he visited Meme in the bedroom where Fernanda locked her up, trusting that she would unburden herself with him of the confidences that she was telling him. But Meme denied everything. She was so sure of herself, so clinging to her solitude, that Orleano II had the impression that there was no longer any link between them. Meme gave no sign of distress. On the contrary, from her adjoining bedroom, Ursula perceived the calm rhythm of her sleep, the serenity of her chores, the order of her meals, and the good health of her digestion. The only thing that intrigued Ursula after almost 2 months of punishment was that Meme did not bathe in the morning, as everyone did, but at 7 at night. Yellow butterflies invaded the house from sunset. One night, while Meme was in the bathroom, Fernanda entered her bedroom by chance, and there were so many butterflies that she could hardly breathe. She grabbed any rag to scare them away, and her heart froze with fear as she related her daughter's nightly baths to the mustard poultices that rolled on the floor. The next day she invited the new mayor to lunch, and asked him to set up a night guard in the backyard, because she had the impression that the chickens were being stolen. That night, the guard knocked down Mauricio Babylonia as he was lifting the tiles to enter the bathroom where Meme was waiting for him. A bullet embedded in his spine confined him to bed for the rest of his life. He died of old age in solitude, without a moan, without a protest, without a single attempt at infidence, tormented by memories and by the yellow butterflies that did not grant him a moment of peace, and publicly repudiated like a chicken thief. The events that were to give Macondo the mortal blow began to appear when Meme Buendia's son was brought to the house. Fernanda had an environment conducive to keeping the child hidden as if he had never existed. She had to put up with him against her will for the rest of her life, because at the moment of truth she lacked the courage to fulfill her inner determination to drown him in the bathroom pool. She locked him up in the old workshop of Colonel Orleano Buendia. He managed to convince Santa Sofia de la Piedad that she had found him floating in a basket. Ursula had to die without knowing her origin. Little Amaranta Ursula, who once entered the workshop when Fernanda was feeding the child, also believed in the version of the floating basket. Orleano II, definitively estranged from his wife due to the irrational way in which she handled the Meme tragedy, did not know of the grandson's existence until 3 years after he was brought home, when the child escaped into captivity due to carelessness. Fernanda, and he looked out into the corridor for a fraction of a second, naked and with tangled hair and an impressive bone-in sex. Fernanda did not count on that mischief of her incorrigible destiny. The child was like the return of a shame that she thought she had banished forever from the house. They had barely taken Mauricio Babylonia away with a fractured spine, and Fernanda had already conceived down to the smallest detail of a plan destined to eliminate all vestiges of opprobrium. Without consulting her husband, the next day she packed her bags, put the 3 changes of clothing that her daughter might need in a small suitcase, and went to look for her in the bedroom half an hour before the arrival of the train. "Come on, Renata," she told him. She gave him no explanation. Meme, for her part, did not expect or want it. She not only did not know where they were going, but she would not have cared if they had taken her to the slaughterhouse. She had not spoken again, nor would she for the rest of her life, since she heard the shot in the backyard and Mauricio Babylonia's simultaneous howl of pain. When her mother ordered her out of the bedroom, she did not comb her hair or wash her face, and she boarded the train like a sleepwalker without even noticing the yellow butterflies that were still with her. Fernanda never found out, nor did she bother to find out. Meme barely noticed the journey through the ancient enchanted region. He did not look out of the window even when the burning humidity of the plantations ended, and the train passed through the plain of poppies where the charred ribs of the Spanish galleon still lay, and then out into the same clear air and the same foaming sea. And dirty where almost a century before the dreams of José Arcadio Buendia failed. At 5 in the afternoon, When they reached the final station of the swamp, she got off the train because Fernanda did. They got into a stroller that looked like a huge bat. They embarked on a river ship. Meme locked himself in the cabin. Twice a day Fernanda left a plate of food next to the bed, and twice a day she took it away intact, not because Meme had resolved to starve, but because the very smell of food disgusted her and her stomach expelled even the water. Not even she herself knew then that her fertility had cheated the mustard fumes, just as Fernanda did not know until almost a year later, when they brought her the child. Meme lost count of the days. A long time had passed when she saw the last yellow butterfly shattering on the blades of the fan, and she admitted as an irremediable truth that Mauricio Babylonia had died. That night they slept in the abandoned colonial mansion, on the planks that Fernanda